Soviet Union was there, in Angola, where Cuba was present, Horn of Africa, Nicaragua, and Cambodia. There, the goal was how to roll back communism by bleeding the Soviet Union at these hotspots. So they provided weapons and arms and training to all these guerrillas in all these countries. There was no interest whatsoever in finding a peaceful solution to the conflict. Because it took time to actually increase the cost and the burden, both in Vietnam and then its ally, which is giving like something like $2 billion a year or something in aid to Vietnam. And so into this breach stepped in ASEAN, and ASEAN basically did two things. On the one hand, it condemned Vietnam's invasion. Every year, ASEAN will sponsor a resolution in the UN General Assembly, which increasing majority, basically condemning the Vietnamese aggression and occupation. But at the same time, and this is important, tell Vietnam, once you withdraw from Cambodia, we will not only talk to you, but you can be a member of ASEAN. So you are a Southeast Asian country, you are part of the Southeast Asian community. But as long as you're in Vietnam, you have violated the basic norm of non-intervention for the region, for ASEAN, so you are not going to be acceptable. But once you withdraw from Cambodia, you are welcome. And it was Indonesia under Ali Alatas, Mukhtar Kusmarfazad, the leaders, and Ali Alatas playing a very important role, try to start the process of dialogue. And so Jakarta Informal Meeting 1, Jakarta Informal Meeting 2, with all the 4 Cambodian factions. And I must also say General Chatichai Chunawan's battlefield to marketplaces policy, which was a failure economically, was success politically. Because it actually, for the first time, the invitation that he made to the Cambodian, I think Hun Sen came to Bangkok, was really a diplomatic breakthrough. So economically, that policy was a failure. I know domestically, it's a kind of hot potato, but diplomatically, it really broke the ice by bringing a Cambodian faction from the other side to actually come in and talk to an ASEAN member. And then Indonesia takes the leadership and organizes all these meetings. The field is very clear. Then the Western powers come in. The Australians come in, and the Australian government has this blueprint for a major peace agreement. And the French, of course, jump in and want to hold this conference in Paris. We have 2 sittings in Paris, 89 and 91. And 91, we have the Paris Peace Agreement. So the Cambodia problem is resolved, at least the diplomatic impasse. But through this process, even though it was not an ASEAN, the conference didn't happen in ASEAN, and I really don't know why. But everybody recognizes the ASEAN's role here. That this was doing the dual track policy, isolating Vietnam but keeping the door open to Vietnam, really is what made the breakthrough. And this is what gives ASEAN international credibility. Comes at the right time too. The Cold War is over, and there is a kind of new spirit of cooperation, and there is an idea the Soviet Union disintegrates and leaves the Cam Ranh Bay, its bases in Vietnam. Well, the United States is not too concerned about Southeast Asia, but everybody thinks ASEAN provides the framework. There's a search for a new regional architecture for East Asia, bringing in China, bringing in Russia, and the Western countries in ASEAN. So where would they go? They find that ASEAN has been already around for several decades. ASEAN has a credibility from the Cambodia conflict. So they latch into ASEAN to create the framework, which is what we have today. So the ASEAN Plus, the ASEAN Centrality, ASEAN Driver's Seat, a lot of it comes out of the Paris Peace Agreement. Not because of economics so much, because ASEAN was not a very successful economic organization, but it was a very successful political organization, at least until then. So I go to economics now and democracy. This is a phase we have development without democracy. You know this as Southeast Asia is a resource economy. This is rubber in Malaysia, tin, and of course natural resources, wood and other things. Then it moves to first import substitution and manufacture. There is a bit of economic nationalism at that time. So the idea is to develop industries which will serve the local need without relying on imports from outside. But then we bring into manufacturing, especially microelectronics and automobiles. And here a new development is the arrival of Japan in a big way. So Japan has reestablished itself, number 2 economy in the world at that time. 1985, massive increase in the value of the yen. Lots of Japanese capital could not be invested in Japan because the cost of labor and manufacturing is too high. So they moved to Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, but to Southeast Asia, like Thailand, Philippines, and Indonesia and the like. So it creates a production network. So it gives kind of an economic meaning to Southeast Asia, which wasn't there. It's not trade. It's not free trade. Trade was intra-company, intra-form, than interstate. The ASEAN free trade area, the idea did not originate until 1992. But the Japanese investment in the region has created kind of a de facto market-driven regionalism, linking not only Southeast Asia within itself, but Southeast Asia with Northeast Asia, and really contributed a lot to Southeast Asian development. Now, this was Singapore in 1955. Now, look at Singapore in 2011. The same area, exactly the same area. One of the most dramatic examples of development in Southeast Asia. And this is, of course, not to let Malaysians down. I had to put a picture of the Kuala Lumpur skyline. A fantastic development by any standards. And there are, of course, costs. And the most important cost is this. This is the slope in 97. Southeast Asians do not take democracy as a requisite for development. People like Lee Kuan Yew would say that democracy and development do not go hand in hand. Look at Philippines and India. So democracy creates indiscipline. He had this big debate with Fidel Ramos sometime in the early 90s, where Fidel Ramos and he got into this debate and say, Lee Kuan Yew's position that democracy and development don't go hand in hand, because democracy undermines discipline. What you need is discipline. And discipline and hard work, thrift, and society over the self is a function of Asian values. And there are two sides to Asian values debate, and both in Malaysia in some ways, and they were good friends in 97. So Mahathir Mohamad was the biggest champion of Asian values, not Lee Kuan Yew, it was Mahathir. Because Mahathir was wildly popular in Japan, where they were kind of very happy with his discourse, even though Japan was a democracy. He was popular in China, and Lee Kuan Yew was more cerebral. Mahathir was more of a dramatist, and very anti-Western in his rhetoric. So Mahathir championed the idea that you can have, Asia has its own values and unity, and who are the Westerners to tell us what to do. So he proposed the idea of East Asia economic grouping, or caucus, East Asia without the Caucasians, so to speak. But of course, this partnership fell up, and one of the few people who opposed him was Anwar Ibrahim, who, the rest is history. You know what happened and where Anwar is today. Finally, we go to globalization and the region. Now, this is dramatic. This picture captures 1 million attention minds. This is Michel Kamedeshu of IMF, director, getting Suharto to sign an agreement, which was actually a pretty innocuous agreement. It's the picture that undermined. This is the picture that killed off Suharto regime in 1998, after the 1997 economic crisis, which started really in Thailand. And once Suharto falls, the development paradigm, democracy paradigm unsettles. Then we have the East Timor liberates. This is a place which was very much the symbol of Southeast Asia's lack of commitment to human rights. This and Burma are the two places where the Southeast Asia's neglect of human rights was actually symbolized in the minds of the West. And when East Timor liberates in the referendum in 1999, for whatever reason, you have to give Habibie some credit here, but we have a new paradigm. And then we have democracy in Indonesia. This is the second parliamentary election, which is kind of considered to be the hallmark or benchmark for consolidation of democracy. And the happy people of Indonesian voters electing their government, nobody would have imagined only 5 years ago or 6 years ago when Suharto was around. This was the longest serving dictator in the world, President Suharto, and a successful dictatorship right until the end. The last couple of years, last year, he didn't deliver, but everybody thought Suharto, father of ASEAN too, at the same time. So when he leaves and we have Indonesia, people worry about the future of ASEAN. But luckily, and this is where identity matters, that ASEAN identity and interaction kept Indonesia going, ASEAN going, and Indonesia actually committed to ASEAN in a big way subsequently. But transnational issues didn't disappear. We have a new breed of threats. These are transnational issues that may arise in one country, but they have global or regional implications. They arrive with very little notice, very suddenly, and they cannot be really resolved by one country, a national effort. You need regionalism. And this also helps ASEAN, where interstate issues divide ASEAN, transnational issues, to some extent at least, unite ASEAN. The Hague is not a best example, but Bali bombing certainly was unifying. SARS was very unifying. If you remember 2003, the severe acute respiratory syndrome, which almost killed off tourism in the region, scared the hell out of us. And Hague in Singapore, just came back. This was a picture taken a few years ago, but it's just back right now. And this is the same skyline we saw before. And ASEAN hasn't done very well in handling this, but this is the kind of transnational issue ASEAN needs to face more and more now. Then we have this new regionalism in ASEAN. ASEAN expands. I mentioned this earlier. ASEAN becomes ASEAN +3, and then ASEAN becomes East Asia Summit. Apart from the ASEAN Regional Forum and APEC, and this is very interesting because you have Barack Obama, the United States for the first time joins the East Asia Summit after calling regionalism in Asia as a solution in search of a problem and saying, what is the EAS? We don't know anything about it, we're not interested. That was like 2 years before Obama's presidency. The US actually signs the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, sends an ambassador to ASEAN, and of course, and has the Burmese president standing right next to him. Major change. Also tells you about changes in human rights and democracy in Burma. And this is ASEAN's new face. Very fond of Surin and myself, and I'm sure many of you are. He was one of the first people, and along with Anwar Ibrahim, who said ASEAN should not take sovereignty and non-intervention for granted. It should not worship sovereignty. He was the coiner of the flexible engagement concept, the concept that really is the new face of ASEAN. More human rights, more democracy, even to the extent that we may want to interfere or seemingly interfere in the domestic politics of states. This is a picture I took. I was there actually sitting next to him in a pondok very close to Jogja. And ASEAN, therefore, has moved. What are the key findings very quickly? Southeast Asia is not a Western invention. I do give credit especially to academics, American professors like D.G. Hall, like O.W. Walters, the Cornell people, the SOAS people. They did a lot to create this region of Southeast Asia. I also give credit to the great powers. The British Southeast Asia Command may be an accident, but they had their contribution. But there is a historical basis to understanding Southeast Asia. And I spent quite a bit of time looking at it, especially when Indian culture and Southeast Chinese politics did come into Southeast Asia, but they were modified. They were transformed in the local context, the process like a localization. And that creates an identity you do not find in India or China. Southeast Asian identity is not Indian identity or Chinese identity. It is a distinctive identity, localized identity. For one reason, you see the two biggest temples in the world, the biggest Buddhist temple in the world and the biggest Hindu temple in the world are in Southeast Asia. Borobudur is the biggest Buddhist temple in the world, a complex, and Angkor Wat is the biggest Hindu temples in the world. There's nothing like Borobudur or Angkor Wat in India. And that's just tell you. China has a 5,000 year of history, a very centralized political system. With the exception of northern Vietnam, which is also questionable, none of the Southeast Asian polities are Confucian. They are more decentralized, more maritime, even in fact a little bit more Indic than Sinic. So Southeast Asia's historical identity is distinctive from India and China, despite the fact that they're being influenced by the two. And therefore, it's not a Western invention, nor is it an invention from outside. I think it has to be, you have to look at the history of Southeast Asia from inside. Then Cold War, yes, Western scholars and World War II contributed to Southeast Asia, but without ASEAN, there will be no Southeast Asia. It was ASEAN which split Southeast Asia from South Asia or Northeast Asia, created this regional identity. I'll give you one example, Sri Lanka. In 1967, Sri Lankan foreign minister was invited to sign the Bangkok Declaration, right here. And the signing of the Bangkok Declaration was held up for 2 days so that Sri Lanka can send its representative. Sri Lankans decided not to because they thought ASEAN was a Cold War product. But in about a decade later, I believe it's 1977, same Sri Lanka, now it's a new name, Sri Lanka, not Ceylon, applies, sends an application to join ASEAN. And ASEAN says no, because you are not a Southeast Asian country. So within 10 years, Sri Lanka goes from being a Southeast Asian country, which is invited, because as you know, there's a lot of historical connection between Thailand and Sri Lanka. Theravada Buddhism basically came from Sri Lanka to Thailand. Sri Lanka was okay as a Southeast Asian country in 67, not okay, in fact, completely different in 77, 10 years. So identity, and this identity was created by ASEAN. And at the same time, this is not a natural given identity. It depends on interactions and solidarity. Unity is really key to this. It's not a given. It cannot be taken for granted. The most important point I'd like to make today is history matters in the sense of China and India. Now, I mentioned about the Indianization, Sinicization period, but just look at ASEAN in 1967. In 1967, China was in the middle of cultural revolution. Had no time, very inward looking, and very destructive time for China. Was only making mischief, but not really, the foreign policy was a negative foreign policy, but very internally preoccupied. India had fought a war with China in 62, a war with Pakistan in 65, and all kinds of rebellions going on. So neither India nor China were in a position to affect the politics of Southeast Asia the way they had done for thousands of years before, either materially or ideationally. But today, India and China are back as big powers. Now, many people will tell you that, and historical sources, that India and China were the largest economies in the world before the advent of European colonialism. In fact, right up to 1800s. So between them, they produced something close to over 50% of the world's GDP. Now, many projections tell you that India and China, in about 30 years' time, will produce about 40% of the world's GDP. Now, when you have two major powers with civilizational imprint, passing through the trade routes of Southeast Asia historically, competing. India and China never competed for influence in the past. They might do so in the future, but when these are coming up, and ASEAN had found a space for itself in 67 because these two powers are not interested or not able to actually come to be interested in this region. They were too internally preoccupied. Now they're back in the game of world politics and regional politics. So what is the option? What is the scope? What is the space left for ASEAN? Will ASEAN be marginalized by these two powers, or will it hold its own? That is really the million, or billion, or trillion-dollar question for ASEAN. And I would also say that U.S. rebalancing, which is largely driven by China, but also by the fact that this is a region of economic growth and dynamism for the 21st century. Now, a lot of ASEAN countries think it's a great thing. But do not forget that historically the interaction of the region has been with the neighbors, including with China. And how to maintain that balance? Too much siding with the US in rebalancing is bad. Indonesian Foreign Minister Martin Atlagawa was in Washington 2 months ago and told American policymakers at a conference that I attended that too much rebalancing is as bad as too little rebalancing. So be here in the region, but don't try to push China too much. Now, this is a Southeast Asian mindset, which I think serves the region very well. Moving away from that is going to be a problem, but there is a temptation to do that as China becomes more assertive. So I'm not saying that it's totally a bad or irrational policy, but it's not going to be cost-free for ASEAN. And finally, forget about Southeast Asia without ASEAN. If ASEAN breaks up, ASEAN splits into anti-China, pro-China, or anti-US, pro-US camps, or the conferences like what happened in Cambodia last year, something like that happens over and over again. You not only forget ASEAN, but you forget the identity of Southeast Asia. The idea that this is a region of over 600 million people, close to $2 trillion in GDP, the crossroads of all the major, between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, between India and China, cradle of civilization, all this will be undermined. And we would probably, Southeast Asia will lose a lot of its importance without ASEAN. So this is the best case I can make for ASEAN on the ASEAN Week. Thank you very much.
And because we spent 56 minutes, it's okay. So I think we have to rearrange the format. Why don't we go for the tea and coffee break now? And then we come back, we start with discussants. Otherwise, only this one discussant will be able to speak within short time. So let's go and have break now, and we come back within 15 minutes. Please be on time, exactly 15 minutes, so at least we can hear all the discussants, what they have to say, and of course, Professor Acharya can interact, and you all can interact later on. Is that okay? Thank you.
I'm so sorry, I should have just...
It's good, that's why I didn't remind you. Everyone is enjoying, so I make a signal with professors who can come and say, let's move on.
Okay.
Very good. Good. So did you bring this book with you here?
Yeah, it's on sale.
Okay.
And this is my other book, but the book is over there.
Okay.
I didn't bring any copies myself because I'm traveling with a lot of luggage.